I've honestly been dreading this chapter ever since I started on this project a while ago, so I guess let's just rip the band-aid off. Lou is by far my least favorite installment of the JDK series, both from a technical writing perspective and like a world-building one. Ordinarily, even if I don't love like all of the plot beats of a BK story, I still like his writing style and like the way that he like crafts his narrative, which is oddly absent here for some reason. This chapter contains a lot more like typos and like weird grammatical errors that make the story like harder to follow at times than BK's usual work. I'm not complaining about how like there's typos or the grammar is not perfect and like it needs to be in order for it to be a real story or something like that. My point is like when the writing technique is so like off the rails to where it's like I don't really understand what the author is trying to say, that's when it gets distracting. And I don't mean like his storytelling in this chapter is so like highbrow or like esoteric that it's just above my intelligence and it's hard to follow along with because it's so deep. Like a lot of times that is kind of the case with his writing, but in this case it's just his narrative errors kind of pull from the atmosphere and make it seem really distracting rather than being like this like art piece type thing, if that makes sense. Like everything that I normally love about BK's writing style is like for some reason the opposite in this chapter of like what it normally is. Anyway, I digress. Like usual, full spoiler alert is now in effect, I guess. If you haven't read the story, first of all, don't. And second of all, the synopsis I'm going to give will breeze over the parts that are like difficult to read. This chapter opens up on like the present day, like Jane did. I love how this series as a whole like couldn't come up with like a better narrative structure than like story opens up on the character at present day and then like flashes back to everything that happened in between the first chapter of the series and Scars of Corruption. Lou is now 18 years old in present day, living in New York City, riding the coattails of the success of his Jeff the Killer book that he wrote. He and his girlfriend Jessica are written in this chapter as parodies of these survivors of tragedy that become celebrities off of like the situation that they survived. There's like this section about how Lou needs to use like fake tears whenever he does interviews because he can't cry on command, and apparently his story isn't compelling enough on its own unless he like cries in front of the cameras, and he won't blow up unless that's the case. It's implied that Lou sees his life as like this sort of cosmic joke that he just wants to like capitalize on and make as much money as possible off of his story, which is so like antithetical to his characterization in every other chapter of the series, but I will circle back to that later. Much like the Jane chapter, Lou and his girlfriend Jessica have like this really awkward expositional conversation about like what their relationship is, which sort of leads Lou into watching like this tape of an interview he did where he explained what happened since the Jeff killings and all of that, and that's kind of where the story proper begins. After Jeff got shot in the face with a flare gun, Lou was obviously brought back to Mandeville to like see him in the hospital. While he's at the hospital, he has this conversation with his dad, Matt, one of the only interesting scenes in this chapter, might I add, where Matt basically tells him that he like knew about all the corruption in Mandeville already and that he had like put up with it because he was trying to make sure that Lou and Jeff didn't have to like live the life of a corporate shill that he had to live in. I think there's a really interesting like insight here about how like his attempt to prevent his kids from like having to deal with all of the BS that he did sort of like leads to them having to deal with all the BS that he did like at a younger age or whatever. It's like that sort of like you cause what you're trying to avoid thing, I guess. This conversation also alludes to like some giant skeleton in Matt's closet that like his wife Sheila is forced to live with. I honestly would way rather read that story than this one, but again, the series never circles back to that or explains how Matt is the cause of the way that Sheila is throughout the rest of the series. So after Matt and Lou had that whole like expositional conversation, again, like the only good one in this chapter, is when they go home and then Jeff, you know, murders the parents. From here on, I'm going to be recounting Lou's story at like lightning speed because it is mind-numbing to get through. Lou gets sent to Austin, Texas to live with his aunt and uncle, not the same one that he got sent to live with when he and Jeff were kind of split up in the first chapter. This is like a different set of aunt and uncle that are like actually good. While he's in Texas, the kids at his school like constantly bully him for like being the survivor of a famous serial killing for some reason, as if that's like prime TikTok content or something. Anyway, he meets this other new girl at his school named Viviana who like sort of indirectly encourages him to like tell his story to anyone who will listen. For some reason, him doing this like makes the bullies stop bullying him and like it makes him like really popular. I do think like within the structure of the way this chapter is that this is kind of like an interesting foreshadow for like how Lou will go on to like become this big sellout that like basically uses all of his emotions and like experiences to like chase like clout or money or whatever. So like if the story wasn't the way that it is, I would find that really interesting. Side note, because I don't really know where else to mention this, Lou's characterization in this chapter is so wildly astronomically different from the way that it is in Jeff the Killer chapter 1 that it really doesn't make sense to me. In part 1, he's written as like this kind of typical immature, like I guess 13-year-old, or like however old he's supposed to be. And he like sort of like communicates and interacts like that way, like the way that a kind of typical kid would. In this chapter, he like communicates in this very like dry and analytical tone that doesn't, again, match his characterization in the first chapter at all. And he sort of has this like almost neurodivergent tone to the way he like thinks and the way he talks to people. It doesn't feel like the way that he was before, which like isn't an issue on its own. I don't have a problem with him having like a neurodivergent tone or like being neurodivergent in the story, but because like the first chapter, he's not like that at all. It feels really like sudden and kind of out of nowhere. Also, I'm not going to pretend I'm like an expert on neurodivergence. I could just be misreading this. I get that. But I feel like someone might try to defend this being like, well, trauma changes people. And it's like, well, yeah, in real life, but like the story doesn't really like earn that. And it doesn't feel like the story is even trying to say that. Like, it's not like he gradually changes or like he has this moment where he's like, my experience made me this way or something. It's more like he just is one character in the first chapter and then he's a completely different character with the same name in this one. Again, it just like everything else, it kind of doesn't really make sense. Also, this is random, but it's weird to me how Viviana, like at the beginning of the story, like when she meets Lou, I almost said Jeff, when she meets Lou, she like kind of encourages him to like tell his story and like use it for like attention or like to get famous or whatever. Like she encourages him to like chase the clout and like ride the coattails of that. But then like at the end of the story, like when he's doing that and when he's like successful at that, she like is mad at him for it, even though that's what she was actively encouraging him to do like at the start. Long story short, it feels like BK wants to like use Viviana as kind of like this mouthpiece for all of his like lofty, righteous like ideals or whatever, but she doesn't really feel like that. She feels like this really like hypocritical sort of two-faced, disingenuous person. But like everything else in this series, she's never brought up again after this first chapter. Her influence on Lou is never brought up again, so like it doesn't really matter anyway. Viviana and Lou go for like a walk outside of her family's house, and she tells him that her family is moving to New Orleans very soon, and like she doesn't want to go because she's like in love with him. Then this like cult kind of appears out of nowhere and tries to menace Viviana and Lou so that whether her and her family leave the city. They have like these scream masks and these fake rubber knives. See, Viviana's father is like this gore artist or something. Like he makes these like art pieces that they get famous for like their shock value. So the conservative people of Austin, Texas or whatever don't like it is essentially the arc of the chapter, even though Austin is pretty widely known for being like the only kind of liberal leaning city in Texas. But whatever, this isn't CinemaSins. I'm not really trying to go down that road. So Casper, Viviana's dad, who makes like the gore art, he catches one of like the members of this cult that was trying to menace Lou and Viviana, and he turns him over to the police. And the police are able to intimidate this cult member into implicating Reverend Carter in this whole situation, who is one of the worst written characters in any story that I have ever read. Anyway, this attack kind of scares Viviana and her family, and the parents decide that they want to move to New Orleans like the following day from this. And during this whole situation, Casper offers to let Lou come with them as like a member of their family, like an honorary member of their family basically, because Lou like tried to protect Viviana while they were being menaced by the cult freaks. From this point on, the story goes from like kind of difficult to, I would say, mind-numbingly awful. I will explain why. For reasons that BK never explains, although he says in the story that they should be obvious, Lou turns down the offer to go with Viviana and her family to New Orleans, even though the narrative explicitly says that he wants to. He leaves Viviana's house and goes home and like goes to sleep, but before he leaves, she tells him to go visit her before she leaves the following evening. Then Lou oversleeps and wakes up to an email from her the next day at 3 p.m. saying that they had already left. This host said that they were leaving at like evening the following day. And yet Lou wakes up like mid-afternoon and they're already gone. So rather than call her like any person would do in this situation, Lou takes an Uber to her house when he already got the email from her saying that they left and that they're not there. And I'm not making this part up. Lou states explicitly in the story that he knows that she's not going to be there. He knows that they've already left because she just told him. But he goes there hoping that she'll be there anyway. So even though he knows that she's not there, even though she has explicitly told him, and the story has explicitly told you, the audience, that Viviana has already moved from the house, Lou still goes there anyway, in some form of like denial or something. And he makes the journey to that house for no reason. Then when he gets to the empty house, he finds the front door ajar. So he goes into it for some reason, again, knowing that she's not going to be in there. Then Viviana calls him while he's at her abandoned house and tells him that he needs to leave the house because she's being texted videos of him exploring the house in real time. Lou, for some reason, does not leave the house or call the police or attempt to get help in any way. Anyway, he just stands there in front of her house watching the video of him exploring the house in real time until he gets abducted by the leader of the cult that had menaced him and Viviana the previous night, whose name, like I mentioned before, is Reverend Buddy Carter. And from here on out, the story makes absolutely no sense. Why did Carter abduct Lou? Lou is like a side character to all of this. He's not even related to Viviana or Casper, who is the reason that Reverend Carter was doing all the things he was doing. Lou has no control over the guy that attacked him last night, who has already been turned over to the police and is going to give that testimony that implicates Carter. Lou's involvement at Carter's supposedly upcoming downfall at this point is so circumstantial at best that it makes no sense for Carter to think that Lou would be useful to him. BK, are you okay? Blink twice if you need help, dog. Anyway, this leads into this extremely drawn-out scene where Carter gives Lou this sermon about, like, judgment and sin and, like, all these weird spiritual topics that are not what the rest of the story is about in any way, and again, never come back. So, like, why are we here? And, like, Carter is written so heavy-handedly with, like, his spiritual judgment metaphors or whatever that it really comes across like BK has some sort of unhealed religious trauma, and he's just writing it out in the story in, like, the most ham-fisted, disingenuous way possible. Look, I want to be clear, I'm not religious and I don't really like have trauma related to that, so I can't fully comprehend or relate to like the kind of trauma or struggle that could put on a person who's been through something like that. But writing in such a weird, heavy-handed manner, it doesn't make your story less terrible just because it's coming out of some kind of trauma that you've dealt with. If it's like a difficult to read, badly written story, then like it's still difficult to read and like badly written, whether it's coming from a place of like pain or not. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be like an asshole. Anyway, Lou and Carter have this conversation full of nothing and it doesn't matter. Essentially, Lou catches on that he's being held in like this shopping mall that doubles as like the church's meeting grounds or whatever. And he also catches on that the cops are on their way there at the moment to like arrest Carter for kidnapping him, obviously. And then Carter offers Lou $1 million and to make sure that his book gets published and that he gets emancipated from his aunt and uncle if he tells the cops that he and Lou are friends. Let me just point out a couple of obvious issues with this that you've probably already arrived at yourself anyway, but I'll just point them out for the sake of clarity. If Carter is so well connected in the courts that he can just like use his legal power to somehow have Lou emancipated as an adult, why is he worried about the cops or prison at all? Like, this man must be untouchable if he can make some random kid into a legal adult. Also, why does Lou care about being a legal adult when he likes his aunt and uncle that he lives with anyway, and he's only like 2 years away from legal status as it is? Like, it doesn't make sense that he would want to even really go down that road. Like, he doesn't express a desire for that at any point in the story, so this feels very out of left field. Also, why would this work to free Carter anyway? Like I mentioned before, the police have the testimony of Viviana and her father and their whole family, as well as the testimony of that cult member that attacked them, saying basically that it was Carter's fault. How is Lou saying that he's friends with Carter going to change any of that? How is it going to acquit Carter of being the leader of like this massive organization of people that was harassing someone who isn't even Lou? It makes no sense. I'm sorry, my brain is like broken. Anyway, for some unfathomable reason, Lou takes the deal, and then surprisingly, Carter lives up to what he said he would do. Like, he gives Lou $1 million, then he makes his book go viral, and then he like emancipates him somehow. As I mentioned before, Viviana calls out Lou for this and like accuses him of being a sellout and says that she like hates him and that he's like a monster basically for, again, using his own story for like attention or whatever, which is what she was encouraging him to do all along. Why are you doing this to me? But hey, BK got his soapbox moment, so I guess that's all that really matters. And that's basically how Lou got from where he was at the end of the first chapter to where he is in like present day, living in New York with a girlfriend who thinks that he needs to cry on camera for his interviews to go viral on TikTok or whatever. It's not like he's the brother of a famous serial killer in this universe or anything. This story, I cannot. So like I mentioned with Jane, nothing really happens in this chapter. At the very end, Lou and Jessica decide to make this like surprise trip down to Mandeville to like ambush interview Jane, but that never comes back, and it's never mentioned again, of course. And that's pretty much it. The JDK universe never comes back around to like focus on Lou again in the entire series. Lou is the brother of Jeff the Killer, who the series is named after, and also who the series is supposed to be about. So like, what? Moving on. I would give the story like 3 out of 10 skeletons, which I think is the lowest I've ever given any story on this channel. If you're reading through the JDK series, this one's honestly a skip. You can get everything that you need to know about Lou's character from Scars of Corruption. Same with like James' backstory, like I mentioned before. So again, this is all pretty superfluous. I guess every artist has like a dud at some point in their career, so I'm assuming that the Lou chapter is just that for BK. At least I'm hoping so, because it's not like the rest of the chapters in the series are this bad. I mean, like the rest of them aren't really. bad at all. Like, they have some issues, but it's not like this. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will cover Randy at some point in the near future. So, bye.